Valeria Costa sat at her kitchen island, the aroma of freshly brewed espresso wafting through the air. The morning light filtered softly through the large windows, casting a warm glow over her meticulously designed home. She sipped her coffee slowly, savoring the moment of calm before the day began. Her thoughts were already on the meeting she had lined up, the reforms she planned to push forward, and the inevitable resistance she would face. Today was the day she would make her first public statement about the changes she intended to bring as the new State Attorney General. As she finished her coffee, Valeria glanced at the clock. She needed to leave soon if she wanted to arrive at the office with enough time to prepare for her first meeting. She rinsed her cup, set it in the sink, and headed to the hallway, where a framed photograph of her parents caught her eye. They had been her greatest inspiration, civil rights lawyers who had fought tirelessly for justice in a time when doing so was often dangerous. "I won't let you down," she whispered to the photo, before grabbing her keys and stepping out the door. The drive through the quiet, affluent neighborhood was as serene as ever. Valeria's thoughts drifted to the stark contrast between these streets and the neighborhoods she had grown up in, places where police presence was often a sign of trouble, not security. As she maneuvered through the winding roads, lined with manicured lawns and grand houses, she couldn't help but think about how different the world looked from this perspective. Here, everything seemed perfect, untouched by the problems that plagued other parts of the city. Her musings were interrupted by the sudden flash of blue lights in her rearview mirror. Valeria frowned, her heart skipping a beat. She hadn't been speeding, and there was no reason she could think of for being pulled over. She glanced at the speedometer to confirm, then checked her surroundings. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for the fact that she was the only car on the road. With a sigh, she signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, her fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. She watched as the police car came to a stop behind her, and a tall, muscular officer emerged, adjusting his utility belt as he approached her vehicle. Valeria rolled down her window, keeping her expression neutral, even as her stomach tightened with unease. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. Valeria handed over her documents, her eyes meeting his. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer glanced at her documents before looking back at her, his gaze hard and assessing. "What brings you to this neighborhood?" he asked, ignoring her question. Valeria's brow furrowed slightly. "I'm on my way to work," she replied calmly, though she could feel the tension building inside her. There was something in his tone, something that made her feel as though she were being accused of something. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" "You work around here?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief as he looked her over again, his eyes lingering on her car, a sleek black luxury vehicle that stood out even in this neighborhood. "Yes, officer," she replied, her patience beginning to wear thin. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" she repeated more firmly this time. Instead of answering, the officer, his name tag read Santos, took a step back, narrowing his eyes as if trying to see something that wasn't there. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Valeria hesitated, her mind racing. This was not a simple traffic stop. She could feel it in the way he looked at her, the way he spoke to her. But she also knew that refusing to comply could escalate the situation. With a deep breath, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car, standing tall despite the knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Do you have any weapons or illegal substances in the vehicle?" Officer Santos asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion that made her skin crawl. "No, officer," Valeria responded, keeping her voice steady. "Then you won't mind if I take a look," he said, already moving toward her car without waiting for her consent. Valeria watched as he began searching her vehicle, his movements rough and invasive. He opened the glove compartment, rifled through her belongings, and even checked under the seats. Each action was a calculated effort to humiliate her, to assert his authority over her. She could feel her anger rising, but she knew better than to let it show. Instead, she stood there, hands at her sides, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, waiting for this unnecessary ordeal to end. As Officer Santos continued his search, Valeria noticed a few cars slowing down as they passed, their drivers and passengers glancing curiously at the scene. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her, as if they too were searching for something to justify the officer's actions. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the injustice she was being subjected to. "This is ridiculous," Valeria finally said, unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. "There's nothing in there." Officer Santos straightened up, a smirk playing on his lips. "You can never be too sure," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Valeria took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "I've been more than cooperative, officer. Is there anything else?" Santos looked at her, the smirk fading as he realized he wasn't going to find anything. But instead of apologizing or backing down, he doubled down. "Get back in the car," he said. "I'm not done with you." Valeria's anger flared, but she knew better than to argue. She turned and walked back to her car, each step deliberate and controlled. Once inside, she reached for her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she dialed a number she knew by heart. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "Daniel, it's Valeria," she said, her voice low but steady. "I need you to send someone over, now." There was a pause on the other end as Daniel, her trusted colleague, processed the urgency in her tone. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Valeria quickly gave him her location, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where she saw Santos watching her with a skeptical glare. "Just hurry," she added before hanging up. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, meeting Santos's gaze with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. "Is there anything else, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Santos smirked again, clearly enjoying the power he thought he held over her. "You're free to go, for now." Valeria didn't respond. She simply closed her car door and waited. She knew Santos hadn't recognized her yet, but that was about to change. Minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens broke the morning silence. Santos turned to see another police car pulling up, followed by an unmarked vehicle. His confident posture faltered as two officers and a man in plain clothes stepped out, their expressions grim. The plainclothes officer, Daniel, walked straight up to Santos, flashing his badge. "Officer Santos, is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying an underlying authority that was impossible to miss. Santos's confidence wavered. "Just a routine stop, sir," he replied, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. "Routine?" Daniel glanced at Valeria before turning back to Santos. "Do you have any idea who you just pulled over?" Santos's face went pale as the realization began to sink in. Valeria stepped out of the car once more, her presence commanding as she joined Daniel. "This is Valeria Costa," Daniel said, his voice firm. "State Attorney General." The weight of those words hit Santos like a ton of bricks. He stammered, his bravado crumbling as he tried to process what was happening. Valeria held his gaze, her expression cold and unyielding. "I suggest you reconsider your approach, officer," she said, her voice laced with a calm authority that left no room for doubt. Santos swallowed hard, his arrogance replaced by a growing sense of dread. He had made a mistake, a huge one, and the consequences were now hanging over him like a guillotine. I didn't realize." "Clearly," Valeria cut him off, her tone sharp. "But ignorance is no excuse for incompetence." Daniel stepped forward, his expression serious. "We'll be filing a report about this incident. You'd better have a good explanation for your actions, Santos." Santos could only nod, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him as the reality of the situation became all too clear. The consequences of this encounter would ripple far beyond this quiet street, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither of them could have anticipated. As the other officers began to question Santos, Valeria turned to Daniel. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice laced with both relief and determination. "But this is just the beginning." Daniel nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I'll take care of the report," he said, his tone reassuring. Valeria walked back to her car, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. As she drove away, she knew that this incident was only the first of many battles she would face. The drama of the morning had set the stage for a much larger conflict, one that would test her resolve and her commitment to justice in ways she hadn't yet imagined. The tension in the police station was palpable as Valeria Costa walked through the front doors, flanked by her assistant and a couple of security personnel. The buzz of activity halted momentarily, officers and staff alike turning to stare at the state attorney general who had just been brought in under the most humiliating circumstances. The murmur of whispers followed her as she made her way down the hall, each step resonating with the weight of the situation. As she reached the end of the corridor, Valeria was ushered into a small, windowless room where Officer Diego Santos sat, fidgeting nervously. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of fear and confusion. The confidence he had displayed during the traffic stop had evaporated, leaving behind a man who was beginning to realize the enormity of his mistake. "Officer Santos," Valeria said, her voice calm but firm, "I believe you have something to say." Diego swallowed hard, his mind racing as he struggled to find the right words. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't realize who you were." Valeria's eyes narrowed slightly. "And would it have made a difference if you had?" Diego blinked, thrown off by the question. "Well, I mean, I would have treated you with more respect." "More respect?" Valeria cut him off, her tone icy. "Respect shouldn't be conditional on someone's identity or status, officer. It should be a given, especially from someone in your position." Diego's face flushed with embarrassment. He had no response to that, and the silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken truths that hung between them. The door to the room opened, and Chief Inspector Marcus entered, his expression grim. "Attorney General Costa," he greeted her with a nod before turning his gaze to Diego. "Officer Santos, I think it's time we had a discussion about your conduct." Diego's heart sank. He had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it hit him hard. He stood up, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity, even as his legs felt like they might give out beneath him. "Sit down, officer," Marcus ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. Diego complied, sinking back into the chair, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He could feel Valeria's gaze on him, but he couldn't bring himself to look at her. "Officer Santos," Marcus began, "you understand the severity of your actions this morning, don't you?" "Yes, sir," Diego muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus glanced at Valeria, who gave a slight nod, signaling for him to continue. "Your actions were not only unprofessional, but they also displayed a troubling disregard for proper procedure and basic respect," Marcus said, his tone stern. "You have brought disrepute upon this department, and there will be consequences." Diego's head snapped up at that. "Consequences?" he repeated, his voice shaky. "Sir, I didn't mean to—" "This isn't about what you meant to do, Officer Santos," Valeria interjected, her voice sharp. "This is about what you did, and what you did was abuse your power." Diego felt the ground slipping away beneath him. He had heard those words before, but never directed at him. Abuse of power. It was a phrase that had been thrown around a lot in recent years, often in the context of police misconduct cases that had made national headlines. But he had never thought it would be applied to him. "I'm not a bad person," Diego said suddenly, desperation creeping into his voice. "I didn't mean to." "None of us are born bad people, officer," Valeria said, her tone softer but still firm. "But we are all responsible for our actions. And right now, you need to take responsibility for yours." Diego slumped back in his chair, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small. "There will be an internal investigation," Marcus replied, "and you will be placed on immediate suspension pending the outcome." Diego nodded numbly, knowing there was no point in arguing. He had seen this happen to others before, but he had never imagined it would happen to him. As he sat there, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, he realized how much he had taken his position for granted. Valeria stood up, her eyes still on Diego. "Officer Santos, I hope you take this time to reflect on what happened today," she said. "Not just for your sake, but for the sake of the community you serve." Diego looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I will, ma'am. I promise." Valeria gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to leave the room, her assistant following close behind. As she walked out into the corridor, the murmurs picked up again, but this time there was a sense of respect in the way people looked at her. She had handled the situation with grace and authority, and it was clear to everyone that she was not someone to be trifled with. Once outside, Valeria took a deep breath, the weight of the morning's events starting to take its toll on her. She had maintained her composure throughout the ordeal, but now that it was over, the emotions she had kept in check began to surface. She needed to get back to her office, to regroup and plan her next steps. This incident had opened up a can of worms, and she knew that the repercussions would be far-reaching. The news of the incident spread like wildfire, and by the time Valeria reached her office, the media was already buzzing with speculation. Her assistant, Maria, was waiting for her with a stack of messages and a worried expression on her face. "Valeria, the press is all over this," Maria said, handing her the stack of messages. "They're asking for a statement." Valeria sighed, flipping through the messages. "Of course they are," she muttered. "But we need to be careful about how we respond to this." Maria nodded. "I've already scheduled a meeting with the communications team. They're drafting a statement for your approval." "Good," Valeria said, setting the messages down on her desk. "But we need to do more than just issue a statement. This is an opportunity to address the bigger issues at play here." Maria looked at her, a question in her eyes. "You mean the systemic issues within the police department?" "Exactly," Valeria replied, her mind already racing with ideas. "This incident is just the tip of the iceberg. We need to address the root causes of this kind of behavior. And that means looking at everything, from training and protocols to the culture within the department." Maria nodded, her respect for Valeria growing with each passing moment. "I'll make the necessary arrangements," she said, already thinking ahead to what needed to be done. Valeria sat down at her desk, her thoughts still focused on the events of the morning. She knew that what had happened wasn't an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a much larger problem, one that she had vowed to address when she took office. And now she had the perfect opportunity to do just that. Meanwhile, Diego sat in the small break room at the station, his head in his hands. The reality of his suspension was beginning to sink in, and with it, a crushing sense of failure. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules and did his job with integrity. But today had shattered that image, both in his own eyes and in the eyes of his colleagues. The door to the break room opened, and Diego looked up to see his partner, Officer Mike Rivera, standing in the doorway. Mike's expression was unreadable as he walked over to Diego and sat down across from him. "Diego," Mike began, his voice cautious, "what the hell happened out there?" Diego shook his head, his mind still reeling. "I don't know, Mike. I don't know what I was thinking." Mike leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "You were thinking like a cop who let his biases get the best of him. That's what you were thinking." Diego winced at the harshness of Mike's words, but he knew there was truth in them. "I screwed up, Mike. Big time." "Yeah, you did," Mike agreed, his tone softening slightly. "But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Diego looked at his partner, the weight of the question hanging in the air between them. "I don't know," he admitted. "I really don't know." "Well, you'd better figure it out," Mike said, his voice firm, "because if you don't, this could be the end of your career." Diego's heart sank at the thought. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and now it was all slipping away from him. "I never wanted this," he said quietly, more to himself than to Mike. Mike reached across the table, placing a hand on Diego's shoulder. "I know, man. But you need to take a long, hard look at yourself and figure out how to make this right." Diego nodded, his mind a swirl of conflicting emotions. "I'll try, Mike. I'll try." As Mike stood up to leave, he looked back at Diego, a hint of sympathy in his eyes. "You've got a tough road ahead of you, Diego. But if anyone can get through this, it's you." Diego watched as Mike left the room, his words echoing in his mind. A tough road ahead. He knew Mike was right, but he also knew that the only way to move forward was to face his mistakes head-on and figure out how to make amends. Later that evening, Valeria attended a community forum that had been scheduled weeks in advance. The timing couldn't have been more poignant, and as she stood before the crowd, she could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her. The room was packed, with people from all walks of life gathered to voice their concerns and hear from their new Attorney General. Valeria had been to these forums before, but tonight was different. The air was charged with a sense of urgency, and she knew that the incident with Officer Santos was on everyone's mind. As she took the podium, the room fell silent, all eyes on her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice strong and clear, "thank you for being here tonight. I know that recent events have raised a lot of questions and concerns, and I want to address those directly." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, and Valeria continued, her eyes scanning the room. "What happened this morning was unacceptable. As your Attorney General, I want to make it clear that no one is above the law, and that includes those who enforce it." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But this isn't just about one incident. This is about a much larger issue, an issue that has been festering for far too long. We need to address the systemic problems within our law enforcement agencies, and we need to do it now." The crowd erupted in applause, their support palpable. Valeria felt a surge of determination as she continued, laying out her plans for reform. She spoke about the need for better training, stricter oversight, and a culture shift within the police force. She promised transparency, accountability, and a commitment to justice that would extend to every corner of the city. As she finished her speech, the room was filled with energy, the crowd on their feet in support of her vision. But Valeria knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready for the fight. As the forum came to a close, Valeria was approached by several community leaders, all of whom expressed their gratitude for her leadership. But as she listened to their words, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. There were forces at play that would do everything in their power to stop her, and she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. As she left the forum and headed back to her car, Valeria's mind was already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. She had made a promise to the people of this city, and she intended to keep it, no matter what the cost. Valeria Costa sat at the head of the long conference table, her eyes scanning the faces of the key figures in the room. The air was thick with tension, and the stakes had never been higher. She knew that the reforms she was about to introduce would be met with resistance, but the events of the past week had only strengthened her resolve. She could not allow the old guard to maintain their stranglehold on the system, not when so much was at stake. "Thank you all for being here," Valeria began, her voice steady but firm. "We have a lot of work to do, and the changes we're about to implement are critical for restoring trust in our law enforcement agencies." The room remained silent, the faces of her team a mix of support and apprehension. Maria, her assistant, sat beside her, ready to provide any necessary documents or details. Across from her was Chief Inspector Marcus, who had been instrumental in handling the fallout from the incident with Officer Diego Santos. "As you know, the recent incident has brought a lot of attention to our department," Valeria continued. "It's clear that we need to address the systemic issues that led to such an abuse of power. We're going to start with mandatory bias training for all officers, and we're implementing body cameras for full transparency." A murmur rippled through the room, and one of the senior officers, Captain Williams, leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "Attorney General Costa, with all due respect, these measures are going to face a lot of pushback from the union. The officers aren't going to take kindly to being micromanaged." Valeria met his gaze, unflinching. "Captain Williams, this isn't about micromanaging. It's about accountability. The public has lost faith in our ability to police ourselves, and we need to show them that we're serious about change." Williams opened his mouth to argue, but Valeria cut him off. "I understand that change is difficult, but it's necessary. We can't afford to let personal biases or outdated practices continue to undermine our justice system." Marcus, sensing the growing tension, stepped in. "The Attorney General is right. We've seen firsthand what happens when officers operate without accountability. It's our responsibility to ensure that doesn't happen again." Valeria nodded in agreement, grateful for Marcus's support. "These reforms are non-negotiable. We're moving forward with or without the union's blessing. The public is watching, and we need to lead by example." Another officer, Lieutenant Rodriguez, raised his hand. "What about Officer Santos? What's going to happen to him?" Valeria took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Officer Santos has been suspended pending the outcome of the internal investigation. Depending on the findings, further disciplinary action may be taken. But I want to make it clear that this isn't just about one officer. This is about the culture within our department." Rodriguez nodded, seemingly satisfied with her response, but the unease in the room was palpable. Valeria knew that she was asking them to go against years of ingrained habits and practices, but she also knew that there was no other way forward. "We need to be prepared for resistance," Valeria continued, her voice firm. "But we cannot afford to back down. The integrity of our justice system depends on it." The meeting continued with discussions on the logistics of implementing the new policies, but the tension remained. Valeria could sense that some of the officers in the room were not fully on board, but she had no choice but to push forward. The alternative was unacceptable. Later that day, Valeria stood at the podium in a packed press conference, the cameras flashing as she prepared to make her announcement. The room was filled with reporters, eager to hear her response to the growing public outcry for reform. Beside her stood Diego Santos, looking somber and nervous, his public confession imminent. "Good afternoon," Valeria began, her voice carrying across the room. "Over the past week, our city has been grappling with the aftermath of a serious incident involving one of our officers. Today, I am here to address that incident and outline the steps we are taking to ensure that such abuses of power never happen again." The room fell silent, the tension thick as everyone waited for what was to come. "First and foremost," Valeria continued, "Officer Diego Santos has something he wishes to say." Diego stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edges of the podium. He took a deep breath before speaking, his voice shaky but sincere. "I want to start by apologizing," Diego began, his eyes scanning the room. "What I did was wrong, and there are no excuses for my actions. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I failed in my duty to serve and protect." He paused, his voice faltering slightly as he continued. "I know that my actions have hurt not only the person I wronged, but also the community I swore to protect. I am truly sorry, and I am committed to making amends for what I've done." The room remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Valeria stepped forward once more, placing a reassuring hand on Diego's shoulder. "Officer Santos has taken responsibility for his actions," Valeria said, her voice strong and clear. "But accountability doesn't end with him. We are implementing a series of reforms designed to prevent such incidents from happening again. These include mandatory bias training, the implementation of body cameras, and a thorough review of our department's policies and practices." As she spoke, Valeria could see the reporters scribbling notes, the cameras capturing every word. She knew that this was only the beginning of the battle, but she was determined to see it through. "We cannot undo the past," Valeria concluded, "but we can learn from it and build a better future. That is my commitment to you, and I will not rest until we have restored the public's trust in our justice system." The room erupted in questions, but Valeria remained composed, answering each one with the same calm authority she had displayed throughout her career. She knew that there would be backlash, but she was ready for it. As expected, the backlash came swiftly. Within days, senior officers and politicians with ties to Diego's father began to plot against Valeria's reforms. The whispers of dissent grew louder, and soon there were rumors of strategic leaks and sabotage aimed at destabilizing her position. Valeria was in her office when Maria walked in, her expression tense. "Valeria, we have a problem." Valeria looked up from her desk, her brow furrowed. "What is it?" Maria handed her a folder, her voice low. "There are reports circulating that some of the senior officers are planning to block your reforms. They're trying to use their connections to undermine your authority." Valeria flipped through the documents, her jaw tightening as she read the details. "So, the old guard is pushing back harder than I anticipated," she muttered. "They're scared," Maria said. "Scared of losing their power, scared of what these reforms mean for them." Valeria closed the folder, her eyes narrowing with determination. "Well, they should be scared, but I won't let them stop us." Maria nodded, her admiration for Valeria evident. "What do you want to do?" Valeria thought for a moment before responding. "We need to go on the offensive. We'll hold a public rally to gather support for the reforms. Let the people speak up and show that they're behind us." Maria's eyes lit up with determination. "I'll start organizing it right away." "Good," Valeria said, standing up from her desk. "And, Maria, make sure we have plenty of security. I have a feeling things are about to get ugly." The rally was scheduled for the following week, and as the day approached, tensions continued to escalate. The senior officers who opposed Valeria's reforms were becoming more brazen, their efforts to block her initiatives growing more aggressive. Valeria knew that this rally was her chance to show them that she wasn't backing down. The day of the rally arrived, and the city's central plaza was packed with people. The atmosphere was electric, the crowd energized by the speeches from community leaders who had gathered to support Valeria's efforts. As she took the stage, the crowd erupted in cheers, their faith in her leadership evident. "Thank you," Valeria began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "Thank you for being here today, and thank you for standing with me as we fight for justice and accountability." The crowd's cheers grew louder, and Valeria felt a surge of determination. "We are here because we believe in a better future," she continued. "A future where every person is treated with dignity and respect, and where those who are sworn to protect us are held to the highest standards." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But let me be clear, this fight will not be easy. There are those who will do everything in their power to stop us, to maintain the status quo. But we cannot allow them to win. We cannot allow fear and corruption to hold us back." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices a powerful testament to the strength of their resolve. Valeria felt a swell of pride as she looked out at the sea of faces before her. This was what she had been fighting for. This was why she had taken on the mantle of Attorney General. "We will not back down," Valeria declared, her voice strong and unwavering. "We will not be silenced. Together, we will build a better future for our city, for our children, and for generations to come." The crowd's response was deafening, their cheers echoing through the plaza. Valeria stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding with adrenaline and pride. She had done it. She had rallied the people behind her, and she knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. As the rally came to a close, Valeria made her way through the crowd, shaking hands and listening to the stories of those who had been affected by the very issues she was fighting to change. It was a humbling experience, and it only strengthened her resolve to see her reforms through. But as she left the plaza, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real fight was still ahead. The threats against her were becoming more frequent, and she knew that her enemies were growing more desperate. She had received anonymous letters, phone calls, and even a few veiled threats in person. But none of it was enough to deter her. Back in her office, Valeria sat down at her desk, the weight of the day's events settling over her. She knew that the path she had chosen was not an easy one, but it was the only one she could take. She had made a promise to the people of this city, and she intended to keep it, no matter the cost. Maria entered the office, her expression serious. "Valeria, there's something you need to see." Valeria looked up, her brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" Maria handed her a letter, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. "It was left on your car after the rally." Valeria took the letter, her heart sinking as she read the words scrawled across the page. "Back off, or you'll regret it." She set the letter down, her hands shaking slightly. "They're getting desperate," she muttered. Maria nodded, her expression grim. "What are you going to do?" Valeria took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm going to keep fighting," she said firmly. "They can threaten me all they want, but I won't back down. We're going to see this through to the end." Maria's eyes filled with admiration. "I'm with you, Valeria, whatever it takes." Valeria nodded, grateful for Maria's support. "Thank you, Maria. We're going to need all the help we can get." As Maria left the office, Valeria sat back in her chair, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She knew that the road ahead was going to be even more difficult than she had anticipated, but she also knew that she couldn't give up. The people of this city were counting on her, and she couldn't let them down. As the night fell over the city, Valeria remained in her office, the lights of the city skyline twinkling outside her window. She knew that she was in for the fight of her life, but she was ready. She had come too far to turn back now. Valeria Costa sat in the front row of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. For weeks she had been embroiled in a legal battle that had consumed every waking moment. Now the moment of truth was at hand. Across the aisle, a cluster of senior officers and their legal counsel whispered among themselves, their expressions grim. They had thrown every obstacle in her path, but today, she hoped, justice would prevail. The judge entered the courtroom, and the murmurs died down as everyone rose. Valeria's heart pounded in her chest as the judge took his seat and glanced at the papers in front of him. "This court has reviewed the evidence and the arguments presented," he began, his voice steady. "And after careful consideration, we have reached a decision." Valeria held her breath, her gaze fixed on the judge's face, searching for any hint of what was to come. "It is the ruling of this court," the judge continued, "that the reforms proposed by Attorney General Costa are not only legally sound, but are also necessary for the proper functioning of our law enforcement agencies. The motion to block these reforms is denied." The courtroom erupted in whispers, the senior officers' faces paling as the weight of the ruling sank in. Valeria exhaled, relief washing over her like a wave. She had won. The legal hurdles that had been thrown in her path were now cleared, and she had the full backing of the law to implement her reforms. As the judge adjourned the session, Valeria stood, her legs feeling shaky but steadying as she reminded herself that this was only the beginning. She turned to her team, who were beaming with pride. "We did it," Maria whispered, her eyes shining with admiration. Valeria nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Yes, we did. But now the real work begins." With the legal challenges behind her, Valeria wasted no time in fast-tracking the implementation of her reforms. The changes were sweeping and immediate. Body cameras were distributed to all officers, and mandatory bias training sessions were scheduled. New protocols were introduced, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and community engagement. The backlash was inevitable. Some officers bristled at the changes, grumbling about the increased oversight and what they saw as a loss of autonomy. But Valeria was unwavering. She knew that these reforms were essential for rebuilding the public's trust in law enforcement, and she was determined to see them through. One afternoon, as Valeria reviewed the progress reports in her office, there was a knock on the door. It was Diego Santos, standing in the doorway with a tentative expression. "Attorney General Costa," he began, his voice respectful but tinged with uncertainty. "Come in, Officer Santos," Valeria said, gesturing for him to take a seat. Diego entered, his posture slightly stiff. He had been working hard to redeem himself, and Valeria had noticed. He had thrown himself into the training sessions, and his demeanor had shifted from defensive to genuinely reflective. "I wanted to thank you," Diego said, sitting down across from her, "for giving me a second chance." Valeria looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Everyone deserves the opportunity to learn and grow, Officer Santos. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Diego hesitated for a moment, then straightened in his chair. "I've been thinking a lot about that. I want to do more than just change my own behavior. I want to help others do the same." Valeria nodded, pleased with his response. "That's good to hear. I've been considering creating a new position, a community liaison officer. Someone who can work directly with the community to build trust and address concerns. I think you'd be a good fit for that role." Diego's eyes widened in surprise. "Me?" "Yes, you," Valeria said firmly. "You've been through this process firsthand, and you know better than anyone the challenges we're facing. I think you could make a real difference." Diego sat back, the weight of the offer sinking in. It was a chance not only to rebuild his career, but to be part of something bigger, something that could change the way policing was done in the city. "I'd be honored," he said finally, a sense of determination settling over him. "Good," Valeria said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'll have Maria draw up the paperwork. You can start immediately." Diego left her office with a renewed sense of purpose, and Valeria watched him go, feeling a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. As the reforms took hold, the changes began to show. Reports of police misconduct started to decrease, and the community's trust in law enforcement slowly began to rebuild. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were still plenty of challenges to overcome, but the progress was undeniable. Word of Valeria's success spread beyond the city, and soon other municipalities were reaching out, asking for guidance on implementing similar reforms. Valeria was invited to speak at conferences, and her work began to gain national recognition. One evening, as Valeria was preparing to leave her office, Maria walked in with a letter in hand. "Valeria, you've been invited to receive an award," she said, her excitement barely contained, "for your work on police reform." Valeria took the letter, scanning its contents. The award was from a national civil rights organization, recognizing her efforts to bring about meaningful change. "This is unexpected," Valeria said, her voice soft with surprise. "It's well deserved," Maria said, her tone filled with pride. "You've done so much, and people are noticing." Valeria smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge until now. "Thank you, Maria. I couldn't have done it without you." Maria waved off the compliment. "You're the one who had the vision. I'm just glad I could help make it happen." As Valeria read over the letter again, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The road had been long and difficult, but it was moments like this that made it all worth it. Despite the recognition and the progress that had been made, not everyone was pleased with the changes. There were still elements within the city who resisted Valeria's reforms, clinging to the old ways of doing things. These individuals, many of whom had ties to Diego's father, had not given up on their efforts to undermine her work. One day, as Valeria was leaving a meeting at City Hall, she was approached by an old colleague, a man who had once been a close ally of her predecessor. His expression was inscrutable as he fell into step beside her. "Valeria," he began, his tone polite, but with an edge of warning. "You've made quite a name for yourself, but not everyone is as thrilled about these changes as you are." Valeria didn't break her stride, her gaze fixed ahead. "I'm aware," she replied coolly. He chuckled softly. "You've shaken things up, no doubt about that. But there are still some powerful people who aren't ready to let go of the past." "I'm not interested in protecting the past," Valeria said firmly. "I'm interested in building a better future." "Be careful," he warned, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've made enemies, and not all of them play by the rules." Valeria stopped walking, turning to face him. "If that's a threat, I suggest you think carefully about what you're saying." He held up his hands in mock surrender. "No threat, just a friendly piece of advice." Valeria's eyes narrowed. "I don't need your advice, and I'm not backing down." He smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Just remember, powerful people don't like to lose, and they don't like being embarrassed." Valeria watched as he walked away, her mind racing. She knew that he was right. There were still forces at play that could pose a threat to everything she had worked for. But she also knew that she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She had come too far to turn back now. The final confrontation came sooner than Valeria expected. Late one evening, as she was working in her office, she received a call from Maria. Her voice was frantic. "Valeria, you need to get out of there. Now!" Valeria's heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" "There's been a breach," Maria said, her voice trembling. "I don't know the details, but security is compromised. You're not safe." Valeria quickly gathered her things, her mind racing. As she headed for the door, she could hear footsteps echoing in the hallway, getting closer. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, listening intently. The door burst open, and Valeria found herself face to face with a group of men, their intentions clear. "Going somewhere, Attorney General?" one of them sneered, stepping forward. Valeria's mind raced, calculating her options. She knew that there was no way out, at least not through the front door. She needed to buy time. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "You've made a lot of enemies," the man replied, his tone mocking, "and they're not happy with the changes you've been making." Valeria's gaze hardened. "I'm not stopping, no matter what you do." The man laughed, a cold, sinister sound. "We'll see about that." Before she could react, the men lunged at her, but Valeria was ready. She grabbed the heavy lamp on her desk, swinging it with all her strength. It connected with a sickening thud, and the man stumbled back, clutching his head. Chaos erupted in the small office, but Valeria fought with everything she had. She knew she couldn't win this fight physically, but she was determined not to go down without a fight. Just as she was beginning to tire, the door burst open again, and this time it was Diego, flanked by several officers. "Back off!" he shouted, his voice filled with authority. The men hesitated, glancing at each other before deciding that it wasn't worth the fight. They quickly fled, leaving Valeria standing in the wrecked office, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Diego rushed to her side, his expression filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Valeria nodded, though she felt anything but okay. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice shaky. "But I'm not stopping. They won't scare me off." Diego nodded, respect evident in his eyes. "I know, and I'm with you, all the way." As they stood there, surrounded by the aftermath of the attack, Valeria felt a renewed sense of determination. She had faced down her enemies and survived, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but she was ready. She had a city to protect, a system to reform, and she wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. The fight for justice was far from over, but Valeria Costa was ready for whatever came next.